Welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel, a practicing analytical hypnotherapist. And so I have with me I have a real treat for you today, because today I have Lisa Sabat, who is a naturopath and who's written a book about emotional repatterning. In fact, it's called Emotional Repatterning. And so welcome, Lisa.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so now I'm a hypnotherapist. So reading your book, it's like I'm sitting at home. It's my world. It's about getting to the bottom of feelings and really reshaping the way that we perceive the world. But so perhaps we could start off with you explaining what emotional repatterning is for you.
Okay, so I think probably the best paradigm to understand that in is to understand that, we have a conscious mind and a subconscious mind, right? So the conscious mind is you and me speaking and my thoughts and your thoughts and our exchange. And the subconscious mind, which in recent studies of the brain over the last couple of decades has revealed that, the conscious mind is aware of about 5% of brain activity and the subconscious mind does the rest, right? So we can appreciate that if we have subconscious beliefs, which we all do have, that undermine us, don't support us, are negative, don't even necessarily make any sense, that's worth the bulk of how we approach life and how we see things. And so, we're all aware of, making an agreement with ourselves to lose weight or to, not snap at our kids or, whatever little resolutions we make. And then, within a day or two, completely failing that. And it's very frustrating as to why, because we're determined, we want to change, we want to do it differently, and we end up showing up almost the same despite our good intentions. And so we've come to understand that there's a whole repository of beliefs underneath our conscious mind that actually dictate our actions. So when we try to change our actions without changing our deeper beliefs, often it doesn't work because we still see things the same way. And with that, it's hard to change how you show up. So when we understand that, we become curious about what do we believe in our subconscious and how did those things get in there? And are those obstacles to us showing up in the world and maybe even finding what we want in the world or manifesting what we want in the world? And so the more I do this work, the more astounded, I guess is really the best word, with how important these subconscious beliefs are and how much mileage we can get out of changing them. So I think it's a really new, at least it was for me when I became exposed to it, it's a new way of really understanding how we perceive things and how we can almost upgrade our own software, if you will, to show up better for ourselves primarily, and then in the world secondarily.
One of the most difficult things I find in working is when I have clients who find it extremely difficult to even conceive that small comments that were made when they were children could have such an impact. And perhaps I've sat listening to them for about 15, 20 minutes. And they mentioned this throwaway comment in the history, and they can't see the connection. And they can't see the connection because their logical mind dismisses it as having any importance. Yet everything that they have just described about the pain that they've been experiencing is echoing that statement. So, I know that you come across this. So yes. Would you explain how it is, why it is that here's the thing. It's people think that because they've had perfectly nice childhoods where there was no trauma,
right,
that there should be no question of there being any connection to things that happened in the past. But it's more subtle than that, isn't it? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I will. I have two thoughts about what you said. So, I definitely see it the way you've said it, which is, most of the subconscious beliefs that we might have that are not supportive or are even obstacles do come from childhood. And we could have had the best upbringing with the most enlightened parents and still have subconscious beliefs that don't serve us, right? And why is that? Because when you're 5 and the big people say something, maybe in a fit of anger, maybe because somebody didn't have a good night's sleep, maybe because a teacher was in a really crappy mood and said, oh, you'll never amount to anything, or maybe a father came home and, was in a bad mood and screamed at the kid or whatever. When you're 5, it's very hard because you don't have the context to say, oh, wow, he's having a really bad day. Or, that teacher should have found another profession because she's not suited to this work. Or my mother's angry and she needs to see somebody to work through her own issues. We don't understand that. We think we're bad. We think we're wrong because those big people who we rely on for our very life can't be wrong. We cannot see them as wrong. That would jeopardize the entire safety structure that the whole thing is built around. So it's got to be us. If these people are mad or upset with us or don't think we're very good, we must not be. So yes, there's a huge link to that. Having said that, though, I don't like to spend too much time on it, right? Because, for me, and I always say this, the past is gone. We can do nothing about that. It all did happen and it's done. So yeah, those little sneaky negative beliefs got in there and we carry them around. For me, it's like, okay, now what? How do we change that and move forward? Because, if you really want to delve into what all that's about, then go to talk therapy and you can be there for a lot of years and you will talk about a lot of it. And I've been there myself and it's super interesting. However, in my experience and many others, things don't necessarily change radically once we do have an understanding of some of these deeper issues. And for me, I'm all about change right now, and that's maybe because I'm an impatient person, and also maybe it's because I'm tired of talking. It's like I want to feel different, I want to be different, I want to show up better, and further understanding of how I got here doesn't necessarily lead to that change. So yes, if there is kind of a few minutes that we can spend on, the who, what, when, where, and why, as I like to call it, it could be interesting and it could lead us to deeper understanding of what's in the subconscious. But I would say, all right, it's not that interesting. More to say, where are we today? How are we feeling? Where are the obstacles? What are our perceptions? How do we feel about our deepest self? What is our really deep and true relationship with ourself, which is where it usually falls apart? And then how does that affect how I see the world? How does that affect of my prescription, my lenses, my perceptions, right? And then if I go in and I can change those subconscious beliefs, which is, very easy to do, ironically, and my prescription gets better, more clearer, less distorted, I see things more accurately and I can engage much better with myself and the world, and the outcomes are really better.
It's so important because we have to understand where it begins, because sometimes people can't even see that it's there.
Yes.
Don't recognize that they actually have that belief. So everything they're telling me is showing me that they have that belief, but they can't identify that they've got it. And because they can't see how the history they just gave me even relates to it, it's become that submerged,
right,
that they're talking it and they're not seeing it. And it's really interesting what you said there as well about the fact that we don't want to, that as children we can't see that the authority figures that are there could be making a mistake, could be wrong, because it threatens our survival and our structure.
Yes.
And the problem with that is that many of us get stuck there in
yes.
our relationship to others and to authority. And what that then means is we are incapable of questioning authority. And therein lies a whole heap of hell for all of us, because that opens the door to being abused personally by authority figures, employers, etc., but by government too,
Wow. Yeah, that's big.
because that's authority. So this is a very fundamental aspect of human psychology that we need to understand, that if we can't outgrow this, if we can't identify that child and help that child to grow up, it's part of being a grown-up to understand that authority is fallible.
Yeah, you're very right.
And so this is vital for us, for our survival, even as a species, because
Mhm.
we can't just follow orders. We can't just believe what we're told unquestioningly, because it could in some way unbalance our structure, of security. We have to be able to be grown up. And so this is vital. So what you said there is really important. And yes, once we get to the bottom of that, then it's time to get to work.
Right. Well, I mean, I think particularly now your comments are very relevant because there's a lot going on in the world. I'm sure nobody's missed that point. And I will say that, you know, my approach has evolved over time to be more of, we can't change anything out there, unfortunately. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we just had a little magic wand and we tapped everybody on the head who wasn't acting the way we wanted, wasn't doing it right, and we just fixed them all? Life would be so much better. And, you know, I never got that wand, and, you know, maybe you don't have one either.
Just as
It's
well,
not possible.
therein
Yeah.
lies the path to totalitarianism too. So
Yeah, well, that's true, you know, assuming that we would be right. You're so right. But, you know, we don't come with that wand. We can't change anybody else. We can't change anybody out there. We can't change, you know, we can't change very much outside ourselves. So, you know, that just leaves one person to work on, I always say, and yay, you know, here I am. I always show up. So I'm ready and available. So when we realize that, and when we define things in that way, well, then I think we become empowered, right? Because when it's your fault and their fault, and, you know, people use language like, well, he makes me feel, and nobody can make you feel, right? I always like to catch people in language, because language is so revealing of our perceptions, right? So my work is really about healing the inner cracks in our own foundation. It seems like that's where the biggest, let's say, benefits accrue, right? So when we really look deeply inside, and, you know, who's had it easy all these years, whether you've been alive for 25 years or 60 years, we've all gotten dinged up and banged around a bit. So how many fractures and cracks have accumulated over time that I don't even realize are there. And so when we go more deeply into things like self-love and self-worth and trusting ourselves, and knowing we're enough, and understanding our worth and value, and believing in ourselves and trusting in ourselves, and here's a big one, knowing that we're safe. And, you know, that safety is on many levels that we're talking about, right? When we work at that level, it's amazing how much things change on the outside and in our perceptions of the outside. Because suddenly, when we're working deeply on ourselves and healing some of those wounds, we become empowered. And that is the root to what you call kind of growing up, right? Because we're not going to necessarily change the government. We're not going to change the authority, the boss, and the whoever. But when we evolve and when we heal inside ourselves, well, things just look so much better.
and also, I think what happens is that we begin to be honest. It's not to say that we were deceptive charlatans
Right.
before, but what we are is we are honest with ourselves. And when we become honest with ourselves, we operate with an integrity that demands the same from others without being judgmental. It's yes, you know, if I'm going to work for you, I want to know that I'm working for somebody who's not a bully, who's not going to abuse power. And because if actually that's what you're going to do, I'm not the person for this job. I'm
but
going
it would take you loving yourself,
exactly.
knowing your worth, knowing that you have a right to set boundaries, believing in your instincts, for you to be able to say, you know what, I'm done. You know, that's not the job for me. And if you don't have that personal sense of wholeness and wellness, you will likely stay in that job with that dynamic going, because you know you can't change the boss and you're stuck with yourself, right?
Exactly. And imagine a society of people with that kind of strength and integrity. So that's what fundamentally fuels change for humanity. And that's the beauty of the work that you're doing, is because it's by empowering individuals by to be the best that they could be, to have that personal strength and honesty and integrity. That's what makes the world a better place. So it's fundamental. And I think too, there was another thought which seems to have disappeared. But yeah, it's that being able to be open and that's it, it's back. So the other thing that you talk about, which is a huge part of healing, is acceptance.
Yes.
And people find that so hard because they think acceptance or forgiveness is condoning, and it's not. It's
Yeah.
really not. It's highly liberating, but it's not condoning. So
Right.
maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Well, I like this point so much. I spent the whole chapter on it, right? So one of the chapters in the book is acceptance, and it's actually my favorite chapter because it's the one I've had the most personal trouble with. I mean, it's just, you know, I'm very much seeing things like should be a certain way, and you know, they never are, right? So then that's been a huge source of frustration for me, both in situations and with people. And you know, it caused me a lot of suffering and it caused me a lot of misery, and I'm tired of suffering. You know, that was partly what motivated the book. It's like, it's not fun. I need to find a different way to approach things, because the way I was doing it wasn't working very well. Because as angry as I was, or as indignant as I was about things that weren't right and should be better and should be different, it didn't change. So it got me nowhere, right? You know, I mean, there's a patient of mine who, you know, this is like a perfect illustration about this point. You know, she had come into my office and her mother had died a couple of years earlier. Her and her mother were very close, and her mother had gone in for a very routine, easy surgery and nothing, just, you know, in and out, or whatever it was. It was, you know, an hour procedure. And she drove her mother to the hospital, and, you know, they wheel her mother away, and she said, "Bye, Mom, I'll see you in an hour." And, you know, she's sitting there reading a book in the waiting room. And the surgeon comes out like 2 hours later and says, "You know, I have terrible news, and I'm so sorry, but your mother died." And my patient couldn't have been more shocked, because there was never a question of that. It was a relatively straightforward procedure. And my patient was in shock, and she was in grief, and she was, you know, dysfunctional, I think, you know, for a couple of years. And she had 4 kids, and it wasn't a good story. Anyway, she ends up in my office, and I listened to her narrative. And you know, you can people reveal themselves rather quickly. I'm sure you find the same. And, you know, she was just sitting there saying, "My mother shouldn't have died. You know, she was only 50, and it was a benign procedure, and it was an elective procedure maybe, and it was 1, 2, 3. And, you know, this shouldn't have happened. And the wrong thing happened." And I'm sitting there, and it's like, well, you know, how do you say this to somebody? I was like, you know, and I'm very direct, fortunately or unfortunately, but I said, well, I think therein lies the problem. It's like, your mother should have died. You know, how do we know that? Because your mother did die. I mean, you know, when we argue with reality, sadly, we always lose, always. So you either get on board or you suffer. So, you know, it doesn't mean you can't be sad about the fact that your mother died. By all means, let's be sad. But arguing with reality is not the right strategy. Your mother should have died because your mother did die. And we don't know, and we don't understand your mother's path and what happened. And we'll never understand that. It was your mother's path. But the first step clearly is coming on board. You don't have to like the fact that your mother died, for sure, but you do have to accept it. And as long as you argue with that and you don't accept it, you're stuck and you'll not move forward, which 2 years later, she had not moved forward. And so it was kind of like the nickel dropped. Like she, first of all, didn't understand that the problem was that she didn't accept her mother's death. The second thing that she didn't understand is that there's a difference between agreeing with and acceptance. Well, no, you don't have to like it. You don't have to agree that it was the right thing and none of that, but you do have to accept it. And so kind of you can almost see on her face the, reconfiguration of her understanding of the thing. And then we worked on using the technique of emotional repatterning, which I describe at length in the book, of getting her to deeply and truly accept that her mother has passed and that this is the right thing for her mother. Because I don't think they make mistakes up there. So if she left, I have to assume it was right. I may not understand that. I may not agree with it. I may not like it, but nobody asked me. So, once we could help her take on this acceptance, like my mother died, I guess my mother should have died because it was her time, because that's what happened. And now let me go on to the grieving of that and the loss and the sadness that my mother's not here with me anymore. Then we could start a flow of energy, whereas before it was, just stuck there and just blocked there. And then it all got so much better. But it was just interesting to see. I think it's one of the best examples that always comes to mind when I talk about acceptance, because as you and I are discussing now, you can clearly see it, right? But she was blind to it.
I think the thing is, there is nothing more painful than broken ideals.
Yes.
And, I can't remember verbatim the quote you gave at the top of that chapter. And I can't even remember who it was you quoted. I just remember loving it. And unfortunately, I haven't got a hard copy.
Yeah, I'm going to read it to you because I know the exact quote you're talking about, because it's also my favorite in the whole book and it's my favorite in total. Hold on. So it's in the acceptance chapter and I have it right here. Okay, so I'm going to guess this is what it was. The gap between how things are and how we think they should be equals our degree of suffering.
Brilliant. That says it all, because in my experience as a therapist, and your experience is pointing in the same direction. Broken dreams are the biggest loss of all, because we invest all of our faith and belief in how things should be.
Yes.
And when they don't turn out that way, we are brokenhearted. And if we're not careful, we become angry and bitter, and we switch off because we have lost faith. And when we lose faith, we lose hope. And therein lies a spiral into depression and hell. Yep. And that's why this issue of acceptance is so huge for mental health. It's a really important spiritual principle, which is very misunderstood, because people think it implies passivity, and people think it implies that it's okay for bad things to happen.
Right.
And it's like, the death, the loss of somebody that you love is just the most appalling pain.
Yeah.
But you can't wish it away. You can't blame yourself for it unless you actually are actively a murderer.
Right.
So you can't, and yet people do blame themselves. If I had done this, if I had done that, happens at ends of marriages. If I had done this, if I had done that. Okay, perhaps, maybe you didn't get everything right all the time.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that this wasn't going to happen. Because in fact, you're not a god.
Right.
And it is not within your gift to fix everything, as we've already discussed with our magic wands.
Right.
So you have to accept that limit. But I find that people very often, that is extremely difficult, that they would prefer to have the guilt to the sense of powerlessness, because they perceive it as powerlessness. And it's not powerlessness. It's an illusion of power, because powerlessness is leaving yourself in that place of pain blaming yourself for failing to have done the impossible.
Right.
That's powerlessness.
Yes.
And or to blame somebody else for how things are.
Right.
That's powerlessness.
100%. And, you know, and I find myself saying all the time to people, take as much responsibility for every situation and problem in your life as you can. Why? Not for the reason of blaming yourself. That's not of interest. It's because the more you own, the more you can do. If it's always about the other people, you have nothing available to you. But if you can take a big share of the dynamic or whatever it is, the responsibility for what you're feeling, then you get to work with that. And then real change is possible. And go ahead. I know you're going to say something.
There is another fact to this. Yes, it's important to see how another person has impacted on you. And it's important to say, these are my boundaries and they've been invaded or I've been abused.
Yes.
Because that's number one, that's step number one, and it must happen. But
Yes.
beyond that, then comes the taking responsibility, right? And because that happened.
Yes. Now what? Now I get to choose.
This.
Yes. Now I get to choose.
I get stuck in saying, they did this to me.
Yes.
You're now entering victim land.
Yes.
And although victim land seems to be very popular at the moment, it's a very unhappy place.
Very unhappy place. And so I agree with you, you know, you own what you can, you see the situation as clearly as possible. And then the key words are, and now what? Right? And now what?
And the most empowering thing of all is that the minute you see what they are responsible for, and you say, and by the way, I am now going to do this, it means they can't do it to you again.
Right.
Because you are now wise to the dynamic.
Yes.
And now that's change. So it's hard talk.
Yeah, it's hard talk. You know, I mean, you know, I just want to make another point about what you said earlier on. I think it was really important about guilt and regret, you know, guilt and regret. If I had done this, if I had done that, if only I had whatever, you know, we all seem to kind of paint that other path not taken as having worked out perfectly, amazingly well. Where's the evidence of that? So that's always funny to me, that the alternative we didn't choose, of course, would have ended up fabulously well, which is, you know, who's to say that? But more to the point, I think, is, you know, another little phrase that I just love that really helps me a lot is, I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. You know, and isn't that always true? We're good people. We try hard. We show up with our best. Of course, if 10 years later I look back on that best and I say, well, that best wasn't very good. Well, yeah, maybe that best wasn't very good, but it's the best I had at the time. And thank God 10 years later, I can look back and say, yeah, that wasn't very good. What does that mean? I've grown in the 10 years to be able to look back and say it wasn't very good. But, you know, no college student would look back at themselves as kindergartners and say, wow, my handwriting was really terrible in kindergarten. Well, you were doing the best you could with what you had at the time, right? Let's hope that by the time you're in college, your handwriting looks a little better, right? So when you frame it that way for somebody, I think that there's another kind of nickel dropping moment there where you say, okay, aha, you know, I did do the best I could with what I knew at the time, and it got me where I went, but I couldn't have done better because I didn't know any more than what I knew. Is that a bit freeing for people? I hope so.
And so we come to the crux of healing, which is love and compassion.
Yes.
What we're talking about is a process, which is hard process. I said it was hard talk. It is hard talk. But the aim is to gain greater compassion for ourselves, which means we have a greater appreciation of ourselves, which is love. And it's not self-indulgence. because those are the tools that are going to enable you to be the compassionate, loving person that you probably want to be. And so you become a better person by going through the hard talk and coming out a more compassionate and loving person, which is exactly why everyone should read your book.
And I'm going to show it to you since you don't actually have a hard copy, which breaks my heart.
There it is.
There it
So,
is.
for those who are interested in Lisa's book, I will put a link to it on the description box for this program, and also a link to her website, which is
lisasammet.com, and the book's website is emotionalrepatterning.ca. Lisa Sammet, S-A-M-E-T, in case it's hard to spell.
And I will also be putting a link to this, to the other wonderful interview that I did with Lisa about her birth chart. So for those of you who want to learn more about Lisa and her life, that link will be there for you as well. And well, Lisa, we could chat all day. I know.
I feel that way too.
So we should find something else to have you back. I'm sure there will be other reasons for you to come back.
I'd love that.
So thank you very much for being our guest today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And once again, remember to look in the description box and you'll find all the links that we've been referring to. And also remember, please subscribe and share. And next week, we'll be talking about sorry, I'm also 1 week ahead and I just lost myself there in the moment. But no, next week we're going to be talking about past life regressions. Until then, goodbye.